Imagine the most powerful man in England, surrounded by wealth and luxury, dying in such agony that his screams echo through stone walls. Imagine a death so grotesque, so utterly repulsive, that even his own physicians fled from his presence. This is not fiction. This is not exaggeration. This is the documented end of King John of England, a monarch whose cruelty was only matched by the horror of his final days. October 1216. A king lies dying, but not in battle, not by assassination, not with any shred of dignity. Instead, he drowns in his own waste as his body literally tears itself apart from the inside. The stench is so overpowering that candles cannot mask it. The pain so intense that morphine hasn't even been invented yet to ease his suffering. And it all began with a feast, and a king too proud to acknowledge his own mortality. Today, we examine one of the most disturbing deaths in royal history. A death that was part medical catastrophe, part divine justice, and entirely horrifying. This is the story of King John, the tyrant who lost everything, including control of his own body. And I must warn you, what you're about to hear is not for the faint of heart. But before we understand how a king's intestines could rupture inside his living body, we must first understand the man himself, because John's death was not random. It was, in many ways, the perfect conclusion to a reign marked by betrayal, cruelty, and excess. King John ascended to the English throne in 1199, following the death of his brother, Richard the Lionheart. From the very beginning, John was viewed with suspicion and contempt. He was the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, never expected to rule, never properly prepared for the weight of a crown. His father had even nicknamed him Lackland because, unlike his brothers, John had been given no territory to govern. When Richard died without legitimate heirs, John seized power through a combination of political maneuvering and raw ambition. But he inherited a kingdom already strained by his brother's costly crusades and endless wars. England needed a strong, capable leader. Instead, they got John, a man whose paranoia and incompetence would nearly destroy the realm. Within years of taking the throne, John had managed to lose most of England's French territories. Normandy, Anjou, and other vital holdings fell to King Philip II of France, earning John another humiliating nickname, Soft Sword. These losses weren't just territorial embarrassments. They represented massive economic and strategic setbacks that weakened England's position in Europe. But John's failures abroad were nothing compared to his tyranny at home. He taxed his nobles mercilessly, often without legal justification. He seized lands on flimsy pretexts. He imprisoned rivals without trial and confiscated their estates. Stories circulated of John's cruelty, including allegations that he had personally ordered the murder of his nephew, Arthur of Brittany, who had a stronger claim to the throne. The nobility grew increasingly restless. The common people suffered under crushing taxes. The church excommunicated John after he refused to accept the Pope's choice for Archbishop of Canterbury. For 6 years, England was under papal interdiction, meaning no Christian services could be performed, no marriages sanctified, no dead properly buried. John didn't care. He simply seized church lands and revenues for himself. By 1215, the kingdom had reached a breaking point. The barons, tired of John's abuses, met him at Runnymede and forced him to sign the Magna Carta, a document that limited royal power and established fundamental legal rights. It was a humiliation unlike any English monarch had faced before. John signed it, but he had no intention of honoring it. Within months, John had convinced Pope Innocent III to annul the Magna Carta, declaring it invalid because it had been signed under duress. The barons rebelled. Civil war erupted across England. In a desperate move, the rebels invited Prince Louis of France to invade and claim the English throne. By 1216, much of eastern England was under French control. John spent the year of 1216 fighting a losing war against his own nobles and a foreign invasion. He marched his armies back and forth across England, winning occasional skirmishes but never achieving decisive victory. The stress was immense. He slept little, ate irregularly, and drove himself to the point of physical and mental collapse. And then, in early October, his body began to fail him in the most horrific way imaginable. The first signs appeared in early October 1216 as John's army marched through the eastern counties of England. Contemporary chronicles describe the king suffering from severe stomach pains and frequent bowel movements. At first, this seemed like a common ailment, perhaps from contaminated food or water. Medieval England was full of such hazards, but this was no ordinary illness. John had contracted dysentery, a bacterial infection that causes severe inflammation of the intestines. In the 13th century, dysentery was common and often fatal. It spread through contaminated water and poor sanitation, conditions that were omnipresent in medieval military camps. Soldiers relieved themselves near water sources. Cooking areas were contaminated with fecal matter. Disease spread like wildfire through armies. The symptoms of dysentery are brutal. It begins with cramping abdominal pain, followed by frequent urgent diarrhea. But this isn't ordinary diarrhea. It's bloody, filled with mucus, and accompanied by excruciating pain as the infected intestines contract violently. The body loses fluids rapidly, leading to dehydration. Fever sets in as the immune system fights the infection. John would have felt his strength draining day by day. Each bowel movement would have been agony, each cramp a reminder that his body was turning against him. His physicians would have tried various remedies. Medieval medicine had treatments for dysentery, though none were particularly effective. They might have given him mixtures of wine and herbs, perhaps opium for the pain, binding agents to slow the diarrhea. But John refused to stop. He refused to show weakness before his nobles and soldiers. A king, especially one fighting for his very throne, could not afford to appear frail or vulnerable. So he continued marching, continued leading his army, even as his body literally fell apart from the inside. It was a decision that would cost him everything. The chronicler Roger of Wendover, writing shortly after John's death, described the king as looking increasingly haggard. His face grew pale, then took on a greyish tinge. He lost weight rapidly as his body could no longer absorb nutrients. Everything he ate passed through him almost immediately, providing no sustenance. He was quite literally starving even as he continued to eat. By mid-October, John's condition had deteriorated significantly. The dysentery had progressed from acute to severe. His intestinal lining was inflamed and ulcerated. Each movement of his bowels would have caused bleeding. The blood mixed with the diarrhea, creating the characteristic bloody stool that gives dysentery its name. But John pushed on. He had to. The French forces were advancing. His rebellious barons controlled much of the country. If he showed weakness now, if he retired to bed and admitted defeat to an illness, it would be interpreted as a sign of divine disfavor. In medieval thinking, a king's health reflected God's approval of his reign. A sick king was a king God had abandoned. On October 12, 1216, King John arrived at the castle of Bishop's Lynn in Norfolk. He was exhausted, weakened by days of dysentery, barely able to stay in his saddle. Any reasonable person would have taken to bed immediately. Any reasonable person would have eaten only the blandest foods, if anything at all. But John was not reasonable. He was desperate, proud, and determined to maintain appearances. That evening, a feast was prepared. The exact details of the menu are lost to history, but we can reconstruct it based on what we know of medieval royal banquets. There would have been roasted meats, venison, wild boar, perhaps swan or peacock. Rich gravies and sauces, heavily spiced to mask the taste of meat that might not be entirely fresh. Bread soaked in wine, cheese, fruit pies heavy with butter and sugar. These were exactly the foods that John's diseased intestines could not handle. Fatty meats would sit like lead in his already inflamed digestive system. Spices would irritate his ulcerated intestinal walls. The sheer volume of food would overwhelm intestines that were already struggling to function. Any physician worth his salt would have forbidden such a meal. But John ate and ate and ate. Chronicles describe him eating with almost manic intensity, as if trying to prove his vitality through sheer consumption. Perhaps he was genuinely hungry after days of his food passing through him undigested. Perhaps he was trying to convince himself and those watching him that he was still strong, still capable, still in control. His courtiers would have watched with growing unease. Some might have tried to suggest he moderate his consumption, but you did not tell a king, especially not King John, what he could and could not eat. So they watched as he gorged himself on exactly the foods that would kill him. The food hit his stomach like poison. His digestive system, already compromised by days of dysentery, could not cope. The stomach acids meant to break down food instead inflamed his already irritated tissues. The food moved into his intestines, which were too damaged to properly absorb nutrients or process the material. Within an hour, the pain began. It started as mild cramping, the kind John had been experiencing for days, but it quickly intensified. The cramps came in waves, each one stronger than the last. John's face went white, then grey. Sweat began to pour down his face. He gripped the edge of the table, trying to maintain composure, even as his body screamed in agony. Witnesses later reported that John had to be helped from the feast hall. The king, who had entered proudly now, had to be supported by servants as he stumbled toward his chambers. His legs could barely hold him. His breath came in short, painful gasps. And the pain, God, the pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced. That night, John's condition went from severe to catastrophic. The dysentery, which had been gradually weakening his intestines, suddenly accelerated. The massive amount of food he had consumed put unbearable pressure on intestinal walls that were already thin and damaged. Something had to give. The human intestine is a remarkable organ. It's approximately 20 feet long, coiled and folded within the abdominal cavity. Its walls are made up of multiple layers: the mucosa on the inside, which absorbs nutrients; the submucosa, which contains blood vessels; the muscular layer, which moves food through via peristalsis; and the serosa, the outer, protective layer. In a healthy intestine, these layers work together seamlessly. But in severe dysentery, especially the kind John was suffering from, these layers become damaged. The infection causes inflammation, which weakens the tissue. Ulcers form, eating through the protective mucosa. Blood vessels rupture. The muscular layer loses its ability to contract properly. John's intestines had been under assault for days, possibly weeks. The bacterial infection had caused extensive inflammation throughout his digestive tract. The constant diarrhea had prevented his body from absorbing nutrients, leaving him malnourished and weak. The intestinal walls had thinned, becoming fragile and vulnerable. When John consumed that massive feast, he created a perfect storm inside his abdomen. The volume of food distended his intestines, stretching walls that were already damaged. The fats in the meat were difficult to digest, causing his intestines to work harder, contracting more forcefully. The pressure built and built, and then, sometime in the early hours of October 13th, something ruptured. The exact location is impossible to know, but likely it was in the colon or lower intestine, where the damage from dysentery would have been most severe. A section of intestinal wall, weakened by infection and stretched by food, simply tore open. The pain would have been instantaneous and excruciating. When an intestine perforates, the contents of the digestive tract spill into the abdominal cavity. This includes partially digested food, bacteria, digestive enzymes, and fecal matter. The abdomen, which should be sterile, suddenly becomes contaminated with some of the most bacteria-rich material in the human body. John would have felt a sudden stabbing pain, unlike anything he had experienced before. It would have been so intense that he likely screamed, a sound that echoed through the stone corridors of the castle. The pain wouldn't have been localized to one spot. It would have spread across his entire abdomen as the contaminated material leaked into his abdominal cavity. His servants rushed to his chambers. What they found was a king in absolute agony, clutching his distended belly, his face contorted in pain. John couldn't lie still. The pain was so intense that he writhed and thrashed, trying desperately to find a position that provided even momentary relief. There was none. When intestinal contents spill into the abdominal cavity, the body's immune system responds immediately and violently. This condition is called peritonitis, an inflammation of the peritoneum, the membrane lining the abdominal cavity. In the 13th century, it was almost always fatal. The bacteria from John's ruptured intestine, particularly E. coli and other fecal bacteria, began to multiply rapidly in the warm, nutrient-rich environment of his abdominal cavity. His immune system flooded the area with white blood cells, trying to fight the infection. This caused massive inflammation, which in turn caused more pain. John's abdomen began to swell. This wasn't just bloating. His belly distended as fluid accumulated in the abdominal cavity. This fluid, called ascites when it's clear or peritoneal fluid when infected, was a mixture of digestive contents, pus from the immune response, and leaked blood from damaged blood vessels. His abdomen would have been tight and rigid to the touch, what physicians call a board-like abdomen. The pain was unrelenting. Every breath John took moved his diaphragm, which in turn moved his abdominal contents, causing fresh waves of agony. He couldn't eat, couldn't drink, could barely even swallow. His physicians tried to give him pain relief, probably opium-based preparations, but nothing touched the intensity of his suffering. As the infection spread through his abdominal cavity, it began to enter his bloodstream. This is sepsis, a condition where the body's response to infection causes widespread inflammation throughout the entire system. In modern medicine, with antibiotics and intensive care, sepsis is dangerous but often survivable. In 1216, it was a death sentence. The first sign of sepsis would have been fever. John's body temperature spiked as his immune system went into overdrive. He would have alternated between burning hot and shivering cold. His heart rate accelerated, trying to pump more blood to fight the infection. His breathing became rapid and shallow. But sepsis doesn't just cause fever. It causes the blood vessels to dilate and become leaky. This leads to a drop in blood pressure, reducing blood flow to vital organs. John's kidneys began to fail, unable to filter his blood properly. His liver struggled to process toxins. His brain, starved of oxygen, began to function poorly. He became confused, disoriented, drifting in and out of consciousness. The infection also triggered his body's clotting system to activate throughout his bloodstream. Tiny blood clots formed in his vessels, blocking blood flow to tissues. At the same time, because so much of his clotting factors were being used up, he began to bleed more easily. This condition, called disseminated intravascular coagulation, caused bleeding from his gums, his nose, even the pores of his skin. By October 14th, 2 days after the feast, John was clearly dying. His chamber had become a chamber of horrors. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of infection, necrotic tissue, and bodily waste. Medieval castles had no plumbing, no proper sanitation. John's servants had to manually clean him as he continued to suffer from dysentery, now complicated by the rupture and infection. The dysentery hadn't stopped just because his intestine had ruptured. If anything, it had gotten worse. His body was trying desperately to expel the infection, which meant constant, uncontrollable diarrhea. But now it wasn't just bloody stool. It was mixed with pus, with necrotic tissue from his dying intestines, with material that should never see daylight. John's servants faced an impossible task. They tried to keep him clean, tried to change his bedding, tried to make him comfortable. But the volume of waste was overwhelming. As soon as they cleaned him, he would soil himself again. The bedding, expensive linens that would normally be preserved and reused, had to be burned. No amount of washing could remove the contamination. The smell became so intense that even John's physicians began to abandon him. These were men who regularly dealt with the sick and dying, who had seen plague victims and battlefield wounds. But the stench in John's chamber was beyond anything they had encountered. Some made excuses and left. Others simply couldn't bear to stay in the room and fled. Chronicles from the period describe the smell as being detectable throughout the entire castle. In the great hall below, nobles and servants could smell the king's decay. They knew what it meant. Death was coming for King John, and it was taking its time. John's appearance had become monstrous. His belly was grotesquely swollen, tight and shiny. The skin had taken on a dark, almost black color as blood pooled beneath it. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His teeth, never good to begin with, were stained with blood from his bleeding gums. He couldn't keep anything down. When his attendants tried to give him water, he vomited it back up, often mixed with blood. His stomach, damaged by the same infection ravaging his intestines, couldn't process anything. He was dying of dehydration even as his abdomen filled with fluid. The pain never stopped. Modern pain management didn't exist. The strongest medication available was opium, and while it might have dulled his consciousness, it did little for the physical agony. John spent his final days in a haze of pain and confusion, occasionally crying out, sometimes praying, often simply moaning. On October 17th, John's condition deteriorated further. The sepsis had now affected every system in his body. His kidneys had failed completely, meaning toxins were building up in his blood. This caused a condition called uremia, which leads to confusion, seizures, and eventually coma. John began to have seizures. His body would suddenly go rigid, his muscles contracting violently. His eyes would roll back in his head. Foam mixed with blood appeared at his lips. These episodes left him even weaker afterward, barely conscious, struggling to breathe. His extremities had begun to turn dark. Without adequate blood flow, his fingers and toes were dying. This is called peripheral necrosis, and it's a sign that the body is shutting down, prioritizing blood flow to vital organs like the heart and brain, while abandoning the extremities. His hands and feet would have been cold to the touch, darkening from purple to black. But even as his body died piece by piece, his abdomen continued to swell. The infection inside was producing gas, a byproduct of bacterial metabolism. This gas had nowhere to go. It accumulated in his abdominal cavity, increasing the pressure, causing even more pain and difficulty breathing. His diaphragm couldn't move properly with all that pressure from below, so his lungs couldn't expand fully. John's breathing became labored and irregular. This is called Cheney-Stokes respiration, a pattern seen in dying patients where breathing alternates between rapid and shallow breaths and periods of no breathing at all. Each time John stopped breathing, those watching thought it was the end. Then, after seconds that must have felt like hours, he would gasp and begin breathing again. On the evening of October 18th, John briefly regained consciousness. Some chronicles claim he made confession to a priest, seeking absolution for his many sins. Others say he was too far gone for coherent speech. What is certain is that he was aware, at least partially, of what was happening to him. He knew he was dying, and he knew it was one of the most horrible deaths imaginable. His last hours were marked by what physicians call the death rattle, a gurgling sound caused by fluid accumulating in the airways. John could no longer cough effectively to clear his lungs. Fluid from his failing heart backed up into his lungs, a condition called pulmonary edema. He was literally drowning in his own bodily fluids. As midnight approached, John's breathing became slower and more irregular. His heart, which had been racing for days trying to fight the infection, began to fail. Without adequate blood flow, his brain was dying. He slipped into a coma, no longer responsive to any stimulus. Just after midnight on October 19, 1216, King John of England died. His heart, exhausted from days of fighting sepsis, simply stopped beating. His brain, starved of oxygen and poisoned by toxins, ceased to function. The pain that had racked his body for nearly a week finally ended. But death did not bring dignity to John's remains. His body had become so infected, so contaminated, that it immediately began to decompose at an accelerated rate. The bacteria that had killed him continued their work, breaking down tissue, producing gas, causing his abdomen to swell even further. The men who prepared John's body for burial faced a nightmare task. They had to move a corpse that was grotesquely swollen, leaking fluids from multiple orifices and emanating a smell so foul that some workers vomited. The intestinal rupture meant that fecal material had spread throughout his abdominal cavity. This material was now leaking out as his body decomposed. Medieval custom required that a king's body be embalmed and prepared for public viewing before burial. But John's body was in such a state that normal embalming was impossible. The embalmers had to work quickly, trying to preserve what they could, knowing that the decomposition was already advanced. They tried to clean the body, but bodily fluids continued to leak. They attempted to dress him in royal robes, but the swelling made this difficult. His abdomen was so distended that clothing barely fit. Some accounts suggest that his body continued to swell even after death, as decomposition gases built up inside. The smell was so overwhelming that the embalmers had to burn incense constantly just to be able to work. Even then, many had to take frequent breaks, stepping outside to breathe fresh air and escape the stench of death. Some refused to return, abandoning their duty despite the fact that this was a king they were preparing. John's body was placed in a coffin, but there was concern about transporting it. The state of decomposition was so advanced that there were fears the coffin might rupture during transport, spilling its grotesque contents. Extra precautions were taken, wrapping the body in multiple layers of cloth soaked in preservatives. Even in death, John received no respect. News of his passing spread quickly through England, and rather than mourning, there was celebration. The man who had been one of England's most hated kings was gone. The civil war that had torn the country apart would soon end. The French invasion would be repelled. England would survive, no thanks to John. John was initially buried at Worcester Cathedral as he had requested in his will, but even his burial was problematic. The coffin had to be sealed quickly because the decomposition continued. When it was finally interred, there were reports that the smell lingered in the cathedral for days. In the years that followed, John's grave was disturbed multiple times. In 1232, just 16 years after his death, the cathedral underwent renovations and his tomb was moved. When it was opened, witnesses reported that his body had essentially liquefied, a mass of putrescent material and bones. The intestinal rupture and infection that killed him had so thoroughly contaminated his remains that even partial mummification had been impossible. The accounts of John's death spread throughout medieval Europe. Chronicles written in France, Germany, and Italy all mentioned the grotesque nature of his end. It was seen as divine justice, God's punishment for a wicked king. The fact that he died from gluttony, from eating too much when he should have shown restraint, was interpreted as particularly appropriate, given his lifetime of excess. But modern medical analysis can explain what happened to John in less theological terms. He suffered from acute dysentery, probably caused by Shigella or a similar bacterium. The infection caused severe inflammation and ulceration of his intestinal lining. Weakened by the disease and then overstressed by the massive feast, his intestinal wall perforated. The perforation led to peritonitis, a severe infection of the abdominal cavity. This quickly progressed to sepsis, a systemic infection that affected his entire body. The sepsis caused multiple organ failure, particularly of his kidneys and liver. The combination of infection, organ failure, and continued dysentery created a death spiral from which there was no escape. In modern times, with antibiotics, intravenous fluids, and emergency surgery, John might have survived. A perforated intestine is a medical emergency, but surgeons can repair the damage, clean out the abdominal cavity, and antibiotics can fight the infection. None of these options existed in 1216. John's 9-year-old son was crowned King Henry III. The Regency government quickly made peace with the rebellious barons, reissuing the Magna Carta and promising to govern according to its principles. The French invasion collapsed without John's incompetence to sustain it. England recovered, though it would take years. The Magna Carta, which John had signed under duress and tried to repudiate, became one of the foundational documents of English law and eventually democratic government worldwide. The principles it established, that even a king was subject to law, that certain rights were fundamental and could not be violated, became cornerstones of Western political thought. So, in a strange way, John's legacy is not his failures, his cruelty, or even his horrific death. His legacy is the Magna Carta, a document he hated and tried to destroy. His tyranny was so complete, so unbearable, that it forced the creation of legal protections against royal power. His failures accomplished what a better king never could have. The death of King John represents more than just the end of a particularly bad monarch. It symbolizes a turning point in English and European history. John's reign demonstrated that unchecked royal power was dangerous and unsustainable. His death, occurring as it did in the midst of civil war and foreign invasion, showed the consequences of tyranny. Medieval people saw John's death as a moral lesson. A king who lived by excess died by excess. A ruler who showed no mercy to his subjects received no mercy from God. The grotesque nature of his death was, to medieval minds, entirely appropriate. This was divine justice made manifest in the most visceral way possible. From a medical perspective, John's death illustrates the vulnerability of even the most powerful individuals in the pre-modern world. A bacterial infection that today would be treated with a course of antibiotics instead became a death sentence. The lack of understanding about germ theory, the absence of sterile techniques, and the primitive state of surgery meant that a perforated intestine was inevitably fatal. The detailed chronicles of John's death are unusual. Most medieval deaths, even of kings, are recorded with minimal detail, but John's end was so dramatic, so horrifying, that multiple chroniclers felt compelled to document it. Their accounts, while sometimes varying in specific details, all agree on the essential facts. John died in excruciating pain, his body literally falling apart from within. These chronicles provide valuable insights into medieval medicine and attitudes toward disease. The fact that John's physicians abandoned him speaks to the helplessness they felt. They had no effective treatments. They could offer pain relief, but they couldn't cure the infection or repair the damage. When faced with such a hopeless case, even royal physicians chose to flee. The accounts also reveal medieval attitudes toward royalty and divine right. John's horrific death was seen as proof that God had withdrawn his favor. In medieval political theology, a king ruled by God's grace. When that grace was lost, disaster followed. John's body, destroyed from within, was a perfect metaphor for a kingdom destroyed from within by bad governance. Modern historians debate how much of the chronicler's accounts to trust. Medieval writers often exaggerated for dramatic effect or to make theological points. However, the core facts, a severe intestinal illness leading to rupture and death, are consistent across multiple independent sources. The medical details, while described in medieval terms, align with what we know about peritonitis and sepsis. John's death also highlights the importance of public health and sanitation. Dysentery was common in medieval armies because of poor sanitation. Soldiers didn't understand that contaminating water sources with human waste spread disease. They didn't know about bacteria or infection. John's death was, in a sense, a consequence of the collective ignorance of medieval public health. King John of England died as he lived, excess without restraint, refusing to acknowledge his limitations until it was far too late. His death on October 19, 1216, was one of the most gruesome in royal history. Not on a battlefield, not assassinated, not even dying peacefully in old age. Instead, he suffered a medical catastrophe that turned his final days into a living nightmare. The feast that triggered his final decline was an act of hubris. Already sick with dysentery, already weakened, John chose to gorge himself rather than show any sign of weakness. That decision cost him his life in the most painful way imaginable. His intestines, damaged by disease and overwhelmed by food, literally burst inside his body. What followed was days of unimaginable agony. The rupture caused peritonitis, flooding his abdominal cavity with bacteria and digestive contents. This led to sepsis, a systemic infection that shut down his organs one by one. All the while, John remained conscious enough to feel every moment of his body's destruction. His servants struggled to care for him as he continued to suffer from dysentery, now complicated by the internal rupture. The smell became so overpowering that even his physicians fled. His chamber became a place of horror, where a king died in his own waste, his body swollen and rotting while he still lived. When death finally came, it brought no dignity. John's body was so contaminated, so infected, that it decomposed at an accelerated rate. The men who prepared him for burial faced a corpse that was more decomposed tissue than recognizable human remains. He was buried quickly, before the corruption could spread further. But perhaps there is a kind of justice in John's end. He was a king who showed no mercy, who crushed his subjects under brutal taxation, who seized lands and imprisoned rivals without trial. He ignored the law, defied the church, and lost half his kingdom through incompetence. And in the end, he received exactly what he had given: pain, humiliation, and an end devoid of mercy or dignity. The Magna Carta, which John tried to destroy, survived him. The principles it established, fundamental rights and the rule of law, outlasted the tyrant who opposed them. John's son, Henry III, would rule under those principles. England would recover and thrive. And John would be remembered not for his few accomplishments, but for being such a terrible king that he forced the creation of constitutional limitations on royal power. So when we remember King John, we should remember him completely, not just as the king who signed the Magna Carta, but as the tyrant who tried to repudiate it, not just as a failure, but as a cruel ruler whose subjects celebrated his death. And certainly, we should remember his end, dying in agony, his body destroyed by disease and his own gluttony, a king who lost everything, including his own bowels, and whose last days were spent drowning in filth. This is the death that awaits those who believe themselves above consequence, above the laws of nature and the needs of the body. John's crown didn't protect him, his power didn't save him, his wealth couldn't cure him. In the end, he was just a man with a ruptured intestine, screaming in pain while his body fell apart. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all. Kings are mortal. Power is temporary, and death, when it comes, respects no title, shows no mercy, and makes no exceptions. King John learned this lesson in the most visceral way possible, and his horrible end echoes through history as a warning. Pride, excess, and cruelty will be repaid in full. The king whose bowels burst open during his reign of terror received, in the end, exactly what he deserved. Not a glorious death in battle, not a peaceful passing surrounded by loved ones, but a grotesque, agonizing end that matched the grotesque, agonizing reign that preceded it. King John is gone, but the horror of his final days remains, documented in chronicles, studied by historians, and remembered by anyone who understands that sometimes history's justice is written in blood, pain, and the spectacular failure of the human body.